Good afternoon, everyone. I am Jeanné Isler, and I'm the Vice President and Chief Engagement Officer at the National Committee for Responsive Philanthropy. And we have the distinguished pleasure of speaking with you after lunch on a sunny day in Florida inside of a building. So we are gonna make it good. We might pop out some surprises. We're gonna do whatever we need to do so that you don't fall asleep on us. This panel is about social justice, and if you know NCRP's work, we talk about social justice in philanthropy all the time. But I wanna set the stage a little bit for what this conversation is going to be. When you look at our world, the average person can easily become overwhelmed by the problems that we're seeing. The last panel talked about deep trauma, personal trauma, community trauma, collective trauma. We are suffering global trauma right now as a human race, and we all feel that on a day-to-day basis to different extremes. So even those of us in philanthropy who have chosen to enter into those problems and try to address them and solve them can sometimes feel overwhelmed. So this conversation is about feeling empowered and not overwhelmed. So these are next-gen philanthropists who are going to talk about their roles in their families and in their families' philanthropy. And specifically, we're going to unpack how leveraging their own power and agency within the context and the privilege that they have can actually change systems and advance social justice. So in philanthropy, social justice means partnering respectfully with the people most directly impacted by the problems you hope to solve, and using resources and privilege to support the empowerment of those people. And I think one of the hardest pieces is that social justice philanthropy also means confronting systems that perpetuate injustice, even and especially systems that we are currently benefiting from. So our collective hope in this conversation is that at some point today during our panel, you are challenged. We hope to feel uncomfortable ourselves and that you also feel uncomfortable, even if it's just for a few moments, and that together we can sit with courage in that discomfort and allow it to convict us to leverage your philanthropy in ways that advance justice. So I'm going to close with a quote and then introduce our panel, and we'll move forward. I love the hip-hop group Arrested Development. I don't know if there are any Arrested Development fans, but they have a song called Pain Things, which is a really beautiful song. And there's a line in the song that says, "I fight against injustice, even my own, including within my family, wherever known." And I think that's just really beautiful because it brings it home. Injustice is not a thing that's out there. It's a thing that we're intimately connected to and that we have power to change. So, Sparks, I'm going to start with you. And everyone here has brought an object with them that is illustrative of who they are and their philanthropy. So tell us about your object, how it represents you, and how it has shaped your becoming a philanthropist who cares about social justice.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. The object that I brought, they say a picture paints 1,000 words, and so I actually brought a picture as my object. It's a photograph of my grandmother, my grandfather, and my mom, and the photo was taken in September of 1945, which, as I tell my story, you'll come to understand the significance of that. So to me, you know, this photograph, it represents family and legacy, but it also represents history, culture, and identity, which for me are elements that in understanding my family's story and unpacking what my values were in philanthropy, all of those elements were something that I had to explore. So what is that story? I'm going to take a moment and describe the story of my family's foundation, and then hopefully from that you'll hear some of the uniqueness in that journey, and I hope that will make folks reflective in their own practice. So my family foundation was founded on the Japanese side of my family in a very unexpected time. Actually, the opportunity came during World War II. So my grandparents were sent to the internment camps during the war, and to avoid going to the camps, or actually to escape from them, my grandfather was a farmer, and the government needed folks to farm for the American government. So they sent him and a busload of internees off to Idaho, where he set up a potato farm, and where they actually brought in daily German POWs. So they had German POWs working alongside internees in Idaho growing potatoes. After the war, my grandfather was able to buy the farm out from the government, and that allowed him to purchase some land in eastern Washington, where he set up a potato processing plant. He developed a process for dehydrating potatoes, which is similar to what TV dinner potatoes are. And it was very timely, and he became very successful with that. Eventually, he sold the company to Carnation, and that's what allowed him to create the Family Foundation. So the Family Foundation, was set up in 1983 when I was 3 years old. But 3 months after it was set up, my grandfather actually had a stroke, and he became paralyzed on one side of his body, and he lost his ability to speak. So growing up, this was a barrier for me creating a relationship with my grandfather. And at the time, I didn't even know to ask questions about his philanthropy or his vision for what the world could be when we allow people to invest in each other. So those were questions I wasn't able to ask him directly, but I was lucky that I was able to explore them later through storytelling. So fast forward to me in my mid-20s, and I was at UC Berkeley getting my master's in social work. And my parents actually challenged me. They said, if you are a person that cares about social justice, maybe before you leave social work school, you should figure out how social justice and philanthropy intersect. And so that actually changed the course. I originally wanted to work clinically with LGBTQ youth, but that changed my approach to really want to explore how philanthropy could help create systems change. I was also very lucky that during that time I was able to go up to Moses Lake, Washington, where my grandfather had his farms and did a lot of his philanthropy, and I was able to talk to directly with the beneficiaries of his individual philanthropy. So I met 65-year-old men sitting there with their families who said, your grandfather paid for college for me. I would never be here if it wasn't for him. I learned how he set up a safety net fund for his workers. I learned that he, in essence, offered the first challenge grants to start the local hospital and local community college. And I learned about all these innovative ways that he, as a Japanese man after the war, used his business and his philanthropy to encourage communities, encourage individuals who had been directly impacted by racism and discrimination, encouraging them to invest in each other and letting everyone know that they played a role in building the community. So that was really the source of my inspiration. And I think I know the beginning we're keeping a bit short, so I think I'll pause the story there, and hopefully later I can touch on some of the gaps in that story.
Yep.
Yeah.
Valaida?
All right. Well, my object is this, and if you've been to a church in the South, particularly a black church in the South, you're probably familiar with the hand fans. And so my story centers around that. I am born and bred North Carolinian, about 8 generations that I can trace, and probably farther back, in North Carolina and the Carolinas in general. And I'm from a small town, Morganton, North Carolina. And it was growing up there with my family that I saw examples of generosity and giving and concern for community, and inspired my sense of responsibility to give back. And so in my adulthood and working as a consultant and writer in the field of philanthropy, was always struck by the absence of stories from black communities and stories of black giving. And oftentimes when the stories or imagery existed around black communities, it was as recipients and not as benefactors. And that imbalance was unsettling for me because I knew a different story. I knew that was part of the picture, but it wasn't the entire picture. So that set me out on a journey and to lift up those stories. And it started with forming a giving circle. As mentioned, I'm a member of New Generation of African American Philanthropists. We're a group that comes together, shares values around giving back to the community and creating change. So we pool our charitable dollars and make grants and convene groups in the community to talk about social justice issues in our community in general. And in the course of creating the circle, I heard other stories. I had those stories of my experiences with philanthropy growing up, just kind of a general practice in our family. But hearing other stories, I thought, wow, you know, we need to lift these up and celebrate them. I think too many people in the Black community don't, the word philanthropy doesn't resonate. While there's considerable amount of generosity and philanthropy that takes place, the word philanthropy and the imagery and stories that go along with it don't include us, so people see it that way. And so I think it was important for Black communities, but also just the field of philanthropy in general, to create a bridge to see that the definition is more inclusive and you know, invite broader participation. And so I set out on writing a book about it, and my muse is my 98-year-old great aunt, who in fact turns 98 on Saturday, Aunt Dora. So her story of generosity, she's always just been a giver, very generous, but she established a soup kitchen in my mother's hometown, and then has invested her Social Security check, all her resources into it. And it was at a point in life I learned that she founded it when she was in her 70s. And I thought, well, she's been giving all her life, you know, isn't it time for her to chill, sit back, rest on her laurels? She's been so good. But I learned that in preparation for her retirement, she went on a silent retreat to ask what next. And for her, the answer was feed the hungry. So she set out and established this soup kitchen in a public housing community, and you know, continued that work for years, for about 25 years before she stepped away from serving food, preparing the food, and running the Our Daily Bread soup kitchen. So her story, our generosity is grounded in church and beliefs, our faith beliefs, and lessons about social justice from our Christian grounding. And this particular fan is part of the book that I ended up setting out, that journey that lasted 1,621 days from the time I, you know, envisioned the idea to the time the book was published. Her hands are featured on the cover, so these are my great Aunt Dora's hands. And it's just ignited a love of philanthropy and of engaging people around more broader, more inclusive stories of philanthropy that tell us that philanthropy is deeper than your pockets.
Thank you.
Oh, I don't want to go next. Such amazing stories. Well, when we were given this prompt to bring an object, and how do you have one object describe your journey? There's so much to talk about, so it's actually quite a hard assignment. But the object I brought was this little shell. I'm from West Palm, so not far, a little bit north of here. And when I got involved with CERDNA and the Andrus Family Fund and our multiple family philanthropies that we have, I felt very much like this little shell. For those that are not familiar, we have quite a large family philanthropy. I think at last count there was about 489 various cousins and adults and spouses. So we like to procreate. There are a lot of us. So I felt very much like this little shell amidst a whole ocean of amazing individuals coming together. And as I specifically thought about my journey with social justice, the shell seemed to resonate more and more in that, you know, as I went through my life, especially as a white, cisgender, upper middle class upbringing, I didn't realize, like most shells, that you don't really control where you go. A lot of it is the tides, and you can't see the tides, but the tides are there, and they move us without us even realizing that they're moving us, and we can end up so far from where we started, even if we do nothing, just because of the systems that are in place that we might benefit from. So as I
as I thought about that journey and as I've gone through it over the 7 years that I've been a part of the Andrus Family Fund, and even before that as I was part of some of our younger family philanthropy experiences, as we go through this journey, it's been really important for me to not only recognize my own benefit from these tides, but to educate not only the rest of the family, but the larger space in which we all live, that these tides are real and that they exist and that you can ignore them as long as you want, but they're still there, so you really can't ignore them. And as much as the tides can move a single shell, it's not until the shells and the sand mold together that the tides can really be held back. Especially being in Florida with the hurricanes and some of the natural disasters that the world seems to throw at us, because we are going through a lot of global trauma right now. It's when all of these tiny pieces band together and really form a larger system to push back and to stop the tides from washing us away from the deeper work that we want to do. And I think that when I think about how we do that work, the only thing I keep coming back to is together. And that's not just together in my own family, with our own philanthropic endeavors. It's with our fellow funders. That's important. Almost even more important, it's our grantees. It's living in community with them and empowering them and giving space for their voices and their stories. And then the wider systematic world in which we live in. So it's been an amazing journey, and I say all the time, it's a constant learning journey. The learning is never over.
Wow, thank you. Thanks for having me here, y'all. So the object that I brought is a magnolia leaf, and it's not from the original magnolia because that was cut down when I was about 4 and a half. I grew up on the farm that my great-grandfather, who started with his father an oil company that became Amoco Oil. So I grew up on that farm where he also raised my grandmother. And when there was a magnolia tree that was sort of the centerpiece. It was our clubhouse. It was my safe space that I ran to as a child. And when I was a child, the farm was owned by my extended family. And there was a decision that was made, not really collectively, but by the older generation, by a small portion of it, to sell the farm to get developed. And so I watched as the whole farm was ripped up, and the magnolia tree that had a ribbon that said it was to be saved. One day we were driving to school, and it had been cut down. And so I think I learned there at a very young age about seeking profit over the planet and over family and over people, and really seeing the fault in that. And I did have the wonderful opportunity of having a kindergarten teacher not let me be passive in this and help me to resist. And so as a 4 and 5-year-old, I was shoving rocks down the tailpipes of the bulldozers that were tearing apart the farm. So my most radical moments as a 5-year-old. But bringing that forward into my adulthood, as my generation has coming into adulthood, we started a conversation with the Family Foundation about how to bring us in a way that felt meaningful to all of us and didn't challenge the older generation, but let us really fund in a way that more aligned with our values. And so after a facilitated process, we ended up convincing the family to start a fund that just the youngest generation controls, and that's my 2 siblings, myself, and my 3 cousins. And so that fund is now a climate justice fund, and it funds both in Philadelphia, where my cousins are based, and also in the Gulf South. And we're starting a conversation about what reparations looks like coming from an oil family with connections to BP and decades of extraction from the Gulf. And just the last thing that I'll say is that while we're working on this really amazing funding that feels really important and like a big part of our, continuing to create a narrative, I'm also looking at this very much in terms of building the capacity of my generation to have conflict together, to build shared values so that we can dismantle the existing businesses that continue to extract wealth from communities through real estate development, through private equity, and so that we can really not only be thinking about where the money is going after it's been made, but also stopping the extraction at the source. And so that's sort of a long-term vision of that as well.
Thank you. So I'm going to ask a few questions, and I know there's so much more to your stories that you haven't shared yet, so feel free to weave them in, even if it doesn't necessarily seem appropriate for the question. Just do what you need to do. But I'm going to start with Kim and David, and I'd like to ask you how you first introduced the topic of social justice to your families, and how did people take it? So what was the response, and how did you navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a topic, right? You know, especially when you're talking about family philanthropy and you're talking about different views and different upbringings and coming together. And I think for our specific board, the Andrus Family Fund, the conversation really started as we looked at our core values. So it was a practice that we went through and said, what are our core values? Let's put names to them. We had amazing outside facilitators come in, which I cannot recommend enough. Having that sort of third party be able to guide the conversation, not he said, she said, they would say that. You know, having that third party really kind of guide the conversation and say, what can we all stand for? And so we picked 4 core values, just opportunities being one of them, deep engagement being the second, connected innovation being the third, and sustained impact being the fourth. And so then the sort of next step as we thought about social justice was really how do we live our values, right? It's a wonderful thing to sit around a conference room table and to sort of what we refer to as kind of talk the talk. You know, it's cool to make the big posters and the whiteboards and the reflections, but how do you walk the walk? Because that's really when the work starts to matter. So we thought if we're really gonna say that we value just opportunities, how are we living that? How does that show up? 365 days a year. And so for us, that was really the driver of how do we start leading these larger conversations about values. And so social justice sort of, it's hard to escape it when you talk about those core values because you have to start living it in a deeper way. And so for us, it was the culmination that ended last year in us bringing on non-family board members, which was really exciting for us because we're in a safe space, we're in a shared space right now. You know, let's be honest, it was a bunch of white people sitting around a table. Who are coming from the same, you know, middle-class families or upper middle-class families. And so when you're talking about just opportunities, you got to start with you. And looking around the table, that was not a just opportunity. Going back to that tide analogy, that the tides had led us to that table, not anything that we had done ourselves. So how do we really live those values? And for us, it was bringing on 3 non-family board members who are fantastic and amazing and have raised our standards and brought so much to the table. But that action really, the seed was going back to those core values and figuring out what those were as a board, and then continuing on to how do we live those actually.
Thanks.
Yeah, we're definitely still in process. We're not there yet, but also a lot of our journey started with a facilitated conversation, and a lot of what social justice I think means to me and to my family is looking at the root causes and the systems. And so the foundation was really funding a lot of direct service, even though which was great, you know, direct service in our family's local areas, but a lot of us were talking about what does systems change look like. And so we brought in a facilitator, and the first step was creating this fund for the next gen, and that really came out of a recognition that we could do something additive, that replacing the direct service was not going to fly with the family, but that there was really an opportunity to do something additive, and that we could do something that wasn't really challenging what was going on, but adding. And then a really exciting part with the younger generation, and at that point, the oldest of us was maybe 28 and the youngest was 15. We sort of said, we're gonna have this fund, and then we had to figure out what and how are we gonna fund? You know, that wasn't part of the original conversation, and so we worked with a facilitator to come together around ideas. And one of the most powerful parts of that was after we'd all agreed sort of on the environment in some way, we had all talked about that, and there was a wide range of maybe we should be funding renewable energy or organizing, and so we came to a meeting and we all presented about an organization that we thought might be exciting to support through this fund, and that was a way that I saw especially my younger cousins really understand through their own, it almost came out of them. They hadn't even fully processed how one could do organizing and social change around climate justice, when just weeks earlier they had said, I don't even know how you could do organizing around the environment. Don't we just need more renewable energy? And so it's really letting people experience themselves. And the last thing I'll say is, as this is a long journey, is that it's also a constant conversation. And it happens in all realms. It happens at the dinner table. Every time I'm home, there's a conversation about social justice. It happens in the businesses. It happens, it's a constant thing. And not, I think it's important to me that we don't keep it only in the boardrooms of the foundation, but really, have these conversations about the impact that our family has across all the ways that we impact the communities around us.
Thanks. So David just talked a little bit about what social justice giving looks like in practice, and Sparks, I want to ask you about that too. So in your giving practice, what does social justice giving look like? And not only in the giving, but also in your internal systems.
Great, and I do want to, I'm maybe doing exactly what you asked us to do in the beginning. I do want to answer that question, but actually to give a little bit more context before, I want to describe a bit more sort of my learning process. So I share with you really the inspiration that led me to philanthropy. Once I was in philanthropy, I decided I really wanted to find community. So I started coming to conferences like this, to different funders' affinity groups and whatnot, all with the question asking, where are the people of color in family of philanthropy? I asked it of the affinity groups. I asked it, and pretty much everybody said, that's a great thing. Like, let's find that community, but we don't know who they are. And if you find them, send them our way, actually. So this was really interesting for me. And at that point, I realized actually, how to answer this question: why are there no people of color in family philanthropy? There was one. There was me. And so maybe thinking about actually why I was here was the way to go about it. And so sort of again those unique factors that allow my family story to in some ways be a counter narrative. So looking back again at that history, one thing to note is that my family's foundation is called the Masto Foundation. And you can't even write Masto in Japanese because the name should be Masuto. It was, the doctor heard it wrong when my grandfather was born and wrote it down as Masto on his birth certificate. So when I went to Moses Lake and met folks that he worked with and everything, I found out he did all of his business over the phone. And actually I'm cheating because I have another little object too. This is actually another photograph, and this is the executive summary of when Carnation bought my grandfather's farm, and it says, introducing the potato people. And if you could see close enough on this photograph, you would notice that there's not a Japanese American man sitting in the photograph. In fact, everyone there, my grandfather's vice president, his plant manager, his lawyer is in the photograph, but he is not in the photograph. So I learned, sort of that ways, without speaking to him, how he was extremely tactical in becoming a successful businessman and having influence, accumulating wealth to then support the community. Those guys in the photo, though, another unique variable is they were allies. He probably, when he sold his business, never would have thought to create a family foundation. Like so many folks in communities of color, it's maybe just not culturally appropriate for us to stamp our name on a family foundation or on a building. And in fact, in many cases, that actually might be very disrespectful to the community. So the very idea of creating a family foundation was only possible because my grandfather had access to these white allies. Also, other factors. There was just an incredible amount of luck and privilege. During World War II, the Japanese at the time had over $500 million seized from them. And now actually, and there were reparations, so about $37 million in the 1990s. But if the value of that money that was seized now could be between $7 and $12 million. So $7 and $12 billion that would be in the Asian Pacific Islander community right now. So it was chance that my family was actually able to accumulate wealth, but that chance happened because it actually was literally built on the backs of prisoners of war. And another thing to remember is it was built on stolen land, that my grandfather was able to buy the land out from the government. It was not the government's to give in the first place. And so actually it originally belonged to the Nez Perce of Idaho and of Eastern Washington. So again, that's sort of luck and chance in history that allowed this opportunity to happen. So this helped me reframe my thinking. So instead of saying, why are there people of color in family philanthropy, I started saying, what is it about family philanthropy or the larger systems and structures that we live in that have denied access, made invisible, or created barriers for people of color to enter into family philanthropy. So evolution in my thinking. Next, I went to business school. So I started to realize over time, working in philanthropy, and also starting to look at the structures and systems of wealth accumulation in our country and how there were massive wealth disparities, massive underrepresentation in places of wealth of people of color. I wanted to explore how business, finance, investing is inextricably tied to philanthropy, these systems of wealth accumulation. So I started thinking, actually, what are the implications of this? What is the impact of basically guaranteed multi-generational inheritance of power and privilege? How does this impact, who's in the room, who's not in the room, how we make funding decisions, the information that we ask for? How does this really impact us in negative ways? If the wealth was accumulated under a system where there was structural racism, many of us, can trace back our family foundations 5 generations or 6 generations. But if you look at our country, there were 5 generations of slavery, and there were 2 generations of Jim Crow. And really right now we're at the beginning of when wealth accumulation can actually happen. In just an example of one community, the African American community. So I started to ask, if this wealth was accumulated in a system of institutionalized structural racism, if nothing changes in family philanthropy, can family philanthropy actually become a tool to perpetuate structural racism? So that led me to sort of my new way of thinking, actually, framing it from the positive. What can I do? And I guess impact generation. What can we do about this? And that actually leads to where I am now. That I'm wanting to explore alternatives. And I've realized that I can't come up with one idea of what equity would be in family philanthropy and say, here, family philanthropy, implement this. That, family foundations are vastly different. Folks are at many different places in their learning journeys and exploring their own histories and their comfort around that. So really what I'm hoping to do, partially why I'm here too, is to create dialogue around different practices in philanthropy that promote equity. And hopefully in hearing those stories, having that dialogue and capturing and recording it, we can start to move more towards equity in philanthropy and actually in ways that reverse inequities of the past.
Great. Thank you, Sparks. So Valaida, in your research and writing your book, you probably uncovered a lot of hidden ways of doing philanthropy, specifically social justice philanthropy, that folks might not be aware of. So kind of to Sparks' point about what are some other ways that we can do things, can you tell us a little bit about what you've seen through your research journey and in your communities?
Sure. I mean, in the conversations and the narratives from the people I interviewed, that social justice lens and strand of work shows up in how we give. And again, to Spark's point, I'm here not as an heir of wealth, but as a spirit of generosity and what I call radical reciprocity, because I recognize, and my ancestors and family members before me recognized, by investing in others, in a sense, we're investing in ourselves and our community as a whole. And so that's a spirit of our giving circle, and also in our grant making. And so some of the ways, at least my giving circle participates in social justice philanthropy is, one, just our very existence, by choosing to have our fund hosted by our community foundation, which there was reference to donor advised funds at community foundations. And I don't know about your communities, but in our community, we have a very prominent community foundation that serves various counties. I think it has over $2 billion in assets, and yet, isn't reflective of our community. And so having our circle, and part of the intentionality of having our fund there was a way to create a connection or bridge with our community foundation, with philanthropic Black leaders in the community, but also to give us insight on how these institutions work, and some of the structures, perhaps disrupt some of the structures or call out some of the structures that pose as barriers for donors to participate or to establish their own family funds. That's an ongoing struggle, but something that we are highly conscious of and intentional about remaining in our community foundation, even in circumstances where you think we should leave.
Do you want to give us an example of a circumstance where one might think you should leave?
Well, I would just say that our value beyond our fund isn't always recognized. The dollars amount of our grants or our Giving Circles fund probably doesn't catch their attention as others. It's particularly in a major banking city like Charlotte. And so, I feel like sometimes we're a nuisance, or we're responded to in a way that makes us feel that way.
Yeah.
And lack of real engagement. Like, you have this pool of 40-some Black leaders in the community, and yet none of us are invited to serve on boards or committees or to be engaged. We had a police-involved shooting of a Black man that led to a big disruption in our community, and yet we weren't a resource to tap or to engage. So the oversight are some of the examples.
Thank you. So Sparks, do you want to start?
Sure. So I think the first part of the question was how did we learn in philanthropy, learn the language, and so on and so forth. Getting a job in philanthropy, but actually the better story behind that is how impossible it was to get a job in philanthropy, and that also ties into what my values are around inclusivity and creating access in philanthropy. After I graduated from my MSW program, I sent out over 50 resumes, and I went on 28 job interviews. For 3 of those positions, I made it to the 4th round. But so, despite all my education privilege and all of my privilege, I could not get in to Family Philanthropy. And it was actually by connecting with the local LGBT community foundation and my mentor there, who took me under her wing, specifically seeing me as a next-gen person coming from a community of color with social justice values. And she vouched for me. And she, as a reference, I've had several mentors of mine vouch for me like that. And that to me, that's what started it all. That it was actually first the access that even allowed me to start to grasp this language and have this dialogue. Were it not for that and that support, I would not be here today. So.
Thank you. Kim, do you want to start, since she was kind of looking at you?
I
and
feel so
called you out?
self-serving by starting. God.
Pop quiz, Kim. Pop
TV
quiz.
after No, I mean, I think for us, when we're thinking about not only obviously our grantees and working in communities, but also obviously again with the mission-related investments that we're doing, community banks, et cetera, how can we lift up communities and really have them flourish in a way that's deeply impactful. And then again, speaking to just our board makeup, for us, really seeing that racial equity move forward in a reflective process of our board. So again, I mentioned it earlier, but we brought on 3 community board members from the philanthropic field, really. I mean, put out the message to different donor funds, to different organizations, to grantees, and said, we want your voices not only lifting up in communities, but lifting up in these boardrooms as well. And that was really important for us to sit and have these positions of power, not just live with us, but really to live in the space where we're making those systematic decisions about giving and how that's going to move forward. And so for us, racial equity was a really, and listen, when you're talking about family philanthropy, I keep coming back to facilitators, and it's an ongoing discussion because not everybody agrees, especially when I'm talking about 489 extended family members. If you ask them ham and cheese or peanut butter and jelly, I don't think we'd get one solid answer. So it's a conversation that we're constantly coming back to, but also steadfast. And this is the work that we're doing, and this is something that we're very passionate about, and this is what we're going to live with and flourish in the space. So it's been something for us that continues to be a #1 priority.
Valaida,
I would just add that part of our circles focus on racial equity, specifically Black-led social change as a Black giving circle. It makes sense, and also the data shows that Black-led organizations have been central to every major movement in America. And so having strong organizations that open opportunities and create change not only for Black communities, but other marginalized communities. So it's, while our investment is looking to be exclusive in that area, the impact we know is greater.
And I think the impact is greater because a rising tide lifts all ships. And I think even when you're talking about one specific area, it helps all of us. It's across the board. It's not just, this one group's going to be risen and everyone else will, fade away. I think it's really important to spread that message that we all rise up.
Thank you.
Great, yeah. As was mentioned on the panel earlier, there's a lot of history of experience, for fighting for justice that goes, especially in communities of color in this country. And so I think that really building on the leadership of communities of color is a really important way to start, continue from here into the future. And really, I think focusing on the self-determination of communities that, for me, social justice is not about fixing a problem. It's about helping a community to build its, to solve its needs and to serve itself. And those are skills, organizing and, building what you need are skills that are transferable to whatever crises and whatever opportunities come forth. And I think that, what Kim's been talking about a lot also, and of bringing those communities of color into the room that are deciding where the money is going is also such a powerful way. And in my foundation, in the Climate Justice Fund, we haven't quite gotten there, but we are this year's grantees, the list of the potential grantees are entirely generated by last year's grantees. We ask them, who do you trust, who's in your community, who do you think we should be funding? And that built this year's grant pool. And so that's a way that it's not quite as full, and I think it's a step, but really bringing in that expertise into the room and not assuming that we as the wealth holders know the solutions. We really don't. In many ways, we've been very much protected from needing our communities to solve crises, and so really trusting the folks.
I just want to raise up how powerful that point was, because I feel like a lot of times when you're looking at a situation, it's looked at as, oh, philanthropy comes in and saves, and it's really not that. It's the communities saving themselves. We have no part of that in the best way. So I think you empowering your grantees to pick that next pool or people that you feel are doing really interesting things, that's so powerful. That's amazing.
We've been talking a lot about the learning journey. We've been talking about innovative practices and motivations, but we haven't talked as much about barriers and obstacles. So Valaida, can you tell us about some of the barriers you faced on your journey and what helped you overcome those barriers?
Right. I think one of the major obstacles that still exists is just the prevailing narrative around what is philanthropy and what is a philanthropist. And part of my work and my passion is expanding that so it is inclusive and it can include all of our stories as illustrated on the stage today, and that it respects and recognizes the range of cultures of giving and how they show up and manifest themselves aren't one simple or only one model. And I think that's important in terms of the future of philanthropy and addressing complex issues our communities face. And some of the points raised by the last question from the audience about the next generation. I think if next generation of givers embrace a broader definition and relationship to their communities, I think issues can be overcome and communities can flourish in new ways. So I'm excited about that. And but that narrative is really hard to break. Not for me. My focus, as I mentioned earlier, has been around shifts within the Black community, around our role and our traditions and our history and heritage as givers, and recognizing that as being philanthropy, and how we can bring our collective moves, minds, and money to create change. And also for the field or mainstream philanthropy or institutional philanthropy, and seeing us as allies and partners in creating change, and that with this broader, more inclusive definition in practice, that a whole world of possibilities exist. So that has been a barrier, and so I continue to focus on it and work on it, not only for my circle, but for the field, and to create new space to operate.
Thank you. David?
I think that our youngest generation is really committed to really changing how wealth is redistributed and concentrated, and really looking towards not continuing the concentration of wealth in our family. And that's both in our personal, how we deal with the personal wealth that we've inherited, and the family business and the foundation. And we've gotten pretty hard stops on thinking about whether the foundation really should continue to grow, or should it be giving away more of its resources now while people are really excited and activated and there's so much need, and should the individuals in the family be giving more of our wealth and investing in ways that maybe are closer to communities and do more for communities, but make less wealth off of the wealth. And so those have been, they feel like opportunities in ways that things are growing, but really challenges in unlocking the amount of capital that we think is needed to make the change that is needed right now.
Kim, I would like to talk with you about power. So you mentioned that you recently expanded the board of Andrus Family Fund to include non-family members. And that could create an interesting power dynamic. So can you tell me a little bit about how the decision-making and power dynamic plays out on your board, and what are some of the challenges and opportunities there?
Yeah, again, going back to those third-party facilitators, so key, really key to have those. They hold amazing space, and we've gone through multiple retreats and groupthink sessions and masterminds around power and privilege, around white power, around some really hard topics that, you leave those boardrooms and you're exhausted. It is like mentally, physically, emotionally, all the things, exhausting and really hard work. But I'm very proud of our board for for going through it. And I think because we went through that work and went through this self-work, it really created an opportunity for us to bring these community board members on in a way that everyone was on the same page, which is really important. Nothing will self-sabotage faster than bringing on community board members and having people not check their power and privilege at the door. That will just disintegrate very, very quickly into a mess. So really doing probably 2 years worth of work before we actually, because we wanted to make really, really sure that we were setting people up, just like at any corporate job with a boss and employee, you want to set people up for success. And so you have to make sure you're in a good place before you bring people on to join you. And so we did a ton of work over 2 years to really make sure that the community board members coming on were going to be set up for success, number one. And then there is very much a family dynamic of, and to be transparent, people on the board who had differing views of, well, how equitable are we going to make this space? Can they hold positions? Can they hold officer positions? Will they have different term limits? Right now on the board, we have 2 4-year limits, like the presidency, before we rotate off. Will they have the same term limits as us? And it was a decision that was finally made that we said, again, if we are living our values, if we are living our values of just opportunities, everything is equal. They could absolutely hold officer positions. They will absolutely have the same terms as us. There will be no difference between us and them. We are all living in this community equally. And that was another thing that was very, very important to us, which I realize now, it does take some getting used to, even for the community board members coming on. There was this dynamic of like, well, wait a minute, like we could run for office, like we could hold a position. And so we didn't realize until we started to see that how unique that was. To us, it just made sense, and it was something that we felt very passionate about, but it was something that we had to do a lot of work in to get to the point of it being a successful, and knock on wood, continues to be a successful first-year practice for us.
Thank you. So Sparks, back to you. That's an internal process that Kim just described that advances equity and social justice. So can you tell us a little bit about your giving practice, both in the giving and also the internal structures that advance justice?
Yeah. And indirectly, maybe answering that question also will answer the question that was asked before. And the answer to that is what am I doing? I'm trying to be a bridge. I'm speaking in places like this, even though there are not very many families whose narratives closely reflect mine. My being here and choosing to be here instead of rejecting the institutions and the systems, which for our generation, a lot of young people more and more increasingly are going to be doing that if they don't see themselves reflected in these institutions. So one, me just being here is an act of social justice, I believe. Tangibly, how is my family, how are we integrating social justice into our practices? So I knew that culture would be important when we developed our Family Foundation's processes. And it was actually last February, my grandmother passed away. And she was 101, so she lived a very long and full life. But that's when all of a sudden, everything I worked in 12 years in philanthropy for was in front of me, right there. So that was a big moment of opportunity for me. Another thing that happened actually was when she passed away, several people gave our family what is called kodan, which is, in Japanese culture, when somebody passes away, you give the family money, often in a red envelope, and as a sign of respect for the person that passed away. And seeing that happen was really interesting for me. And it actually made me start to reflect on culture, and it made me want to learn more about giving in Japanese communities, of which there might not be, by our standards, a robust field of philanthropy. However, there are literally a dozen words to express gift giving. So there are times and ways that money exchanges hands that is different and more aligned with culture. So this really made me start to think, what are the ways that we are integrating or not integrating culture into our practices? And how can the way in which we give not only manifest our values, but manifest our culture? And so originally I was looking at creating the systems and then with a lens on diversity, equity, and inclusion, augmenting them to be more aligned with our culture. What I actually decided to do in the end and what we're hoping to do is actually completely throw out the rule book, to recognize that most of the practices and in philanthropy were created in a white dominant context. That the processes of proposals and evaluations and everything we ask for, everything that is a way of doing that now is normalized as the way of doing, was not created with stakeholders at the table, and was created, really to support the needs of the funders more often. So again, that's why we're looking at sort of, just starting from scratch. What are the minimum requirements to be a family foundation? We want to meet those, because if we don't, that'll be one less family foundation in a community of color. But beyond that, then, starting everything with culture. Like, what would that giving look like? So that's what we're asking right now. And so really thinking about the origins of the processes and how those were put in place. Evaluating whether those processes were put in place actually to reinforce power and privilege. And so in doing this, exploring this, hopefully talking about it, maybe writing about it, that will just give philanthropy new models of ways of doing things, which is exactly what I think we need to do to move forward to social justice.
Thank you. So David, I wanted to ask you about progressive social justice philanthropy. There are more and more foundations, family foundations and others, who want to invest in equity, racial equity, progressive philanthropy, social justice, issues that tend to be on the social justice sort of rhetoric framework. And I'm wondering if you have any critiques of mainstream progressive philanthropy and what you and your foundation are thinking about doing differently.
Yeah, I'm certainly no expert among lots of folks that have plenty of critiques, I'm sure, but I think a main one is thinking that we are the right people to be using this wealth to solve issues. It seems to me like the sort of narrative of family foundations has been one of taking wealth out of the public sphere through avoiding taxes, and then saying that really undermines our democracy, and then saying, how do we fix the little pieces of the democracy that we see or we care about that are now broken. And so I think that in some ways the whole concept is a flawed concept, in that what really needs to be happening is that we're working for a better tax system that makes family foundations and wealthy people no longer have the wealth and the power that they hold. And my family's not currently doing anything to address that from our foundation's perspective. And then I think we've been getting to sort of a lot of the holes throughout this, and really thinking about who is making the decisions, and what I think that this whole concept of legacy is a really challenging one, and I think we do a lot as the youngest generation of respecting where the wealth has come from, and understanding that my great-grandfather was very philanthropic and cared about a lot of things, and didn't know about climate change when he was extracting oil and creating this massive infrastructure, but that we do now, and that we can be working on that now, and that's and I think it's been said already that changing a course is not repudiating or it's working on reparations and repairing harm, not saying that there wasn't value that came before us.
Oh boy. And on that. It was
In 2
just-
minutes or less.
Yeah, in 2 minutes or less.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, not in any perfect way. I'm learning to embrace imperfection, and I'm learning to really remember that the first word in family philanthropy is family _____. We are lucky that the board. It was my grandmother, me, my sister, and my mother. Now it's my mother, my sister, and me. We haven't decided yet when, if, or how we'll integrate outside family members. But being small helps us be a bit more swift. But also 3 is a hard number. And even in just sort of our first retreats that we've had, I've seen family dynamics bubble up to the surface a bit. And so I'm learning that sort of despite everything I learned in philanthropy, working in the field of philanthropy, it comes down to talking to my mom and my sister. And so it's baby steps. And mostly, though, I'm hoping that we can start with legacy and with the stories, and then from that unpack where our common values are, how those values represent what my grandfather's values were, which, in a very bittersweet way, he was never able to really manifest his vision in philanthropy. So I think that that's something that all 3 of us will definitely rally behind and will be a start.
So as we close our panel, I want to recap a few key themes that we heard, and also make sure that we address what was on the last index card here, which ties nicely to what we were going to do. So I heard a lot about the tide in various ways. I really liked your metaphor, Kim, but all of us talked about it in various ways, and both the seen and unseen tides that have brought us to this space, this moment right now, and the power and agency that we hold because of it. We talked about values, we talked about non-traditional ways of giving, and being very attentive to what is outside of the mainstream, what is outside of the formal, but is still extremely valuable, and honoring that in one another and demanding that other people recognize that in ourselves. We talked a lot about our ancestors, for better or worse, and how many of them are good people doing the best they could in the times that they were in, and that we can still acknowledge their shortcomings, and we can still acknowledge the shortcomings of what they did without losing the fact that we love them and that they loved us and that they are and were good people. So as we close, this person asked what each of you are grappling with for next steps. So we discussed an ask and offer process. So I'm going to invite each of you to make an ask of the audience and then also to offer something to the audience. And if it makes sense, if there's something that you're still wrestling with in your own philanthropy that can be encompassed in that ask and offer, I ask you to weave that in. And then I'll close this out. So we'll start with David and then work our way straight down the line.
Okay. I guess an ask is that everybody takes time to think about how you are being transformed and how you can be transformed through your philanthropy and by your grantees, and think about how you're not only trying to impact them, but really bringing our grantees' impact to us. And I guess an offer is a conversation. I'd love to talk now or later, any time to folks about, especially bringing in the next generation. I think that that there aren't so many young folks here. So if you're in that next generation or in an older generation, thinking about how to bring in another generation in a way that feels generative, I would love to talk to you about it.
Thank you. Kim?
My ask would be that when you're going home tonight, whether you're driving in a car or riding in an airplane, I'm sure you're consuming some form of entertainment, whether it's movies or podcasts or magazines. So I would also challenge everyone to maybe consume a little bit of this work as you think about entertainment. You set me up perfectly for Edgar's book that I recommend, Decolonizing Wealth. We also have a podcast called Out of the Margins, which has been a really powerful project that we've worked on. And I would also offer that if anybody has questions, not only about next-gen boards, but about bringing on community board members, I'd love to talk to you about how we did it and best practices. And God knows we weren't perfect, so mistakes that we made as well.
Valaida?
I would ask that you, I would say that part of my journey I mentioned with the book, and then the book is been re-envisioned or reimagined as a museum exhibition. And so I've seen groups come together and discuss cultures of giving that are more inclusive and different values associated with that. And one of the things we say with the exhibit is come to see philanthropy differently. So that's what I ask of you, if through connecting with people outside of your family, outside of your philanthropy network, to engage more broadly and in inclusive ways, that you see new possibilities for philanthropy and perhaps come to reframe it or redefine it for you, for yourself.
The second part of my ask is as we started this conversation, I challenge everyone here, put yourself in an uncomfortable place. For folks of color in the United States, the day does not go by that we don't think about race. It is impossible not to think about race. And so often in these spaces, race is just not ever mentioned. And so I think, challenge everyone here to think explicitly about race, which also involves thinking about your own identity. And it also involves asking questions that you think might not be politically correct, but with an open mind and an open heart. So really put yourself in that uncomfortable place, because there are a lot of people that we're trying to serve that every day live in an uncomfortable place. The offer that I could have is that I will continue to do this work. That I'm involved now with the National Center for Family Philanthropy, and I welcome folks to come to the conference in October and continue these conversations. So I'm going to continue to rock the boat and share this information, and just invite you to come and talk to me about any of these issues, especially the ones that made you uncomfortable, and I promise to hear it and in the spirit of collaboration and really just improving how we serve our communities.
And I will also add a brief ask and offer. So similar to what Sparks was sharing, I think moving ourselves intentionally into uncomfortable spaces is one of the most powerful and courageous things we can do. And so I encourage all of us to think about the origin of our family's wealth, even if we don't think that is significant, not only the impact of our philanthropy, but the impact of the wealth making, because that too is a part of our story that can inform what we do now. And the offer that I make is the resources of NCRP. We're 42 years old. We have a ton of resources. One is called Power Moves, which is a toolkit if you want to learn how to make your philanthropic giving more equitable. But please come and talk with me or contact us at any time, because we would love to support. So with that, I invite us to give a round of applause to David, Kim, Valaida, and Sparks.